Imagine waking up in your own bed, walking out your front door, and realizing the entire operating system of your society has just completely changed overnight.
Right, like the actual physical flag flying over your town has been swapped out while you were sleeping.
Exactly. And over the span of just 4 decades, this happens to you 3 separate times.
Which is just a dizzying amount of political whiplash for one lifetime.
It really is. I mean, picture this. Your neighbor to the left is a French fur trapper, right? His family has been pulling beaver pelts out of the river for a generation.
Yeah.
And your neighbor to the right is a newly arrived Spanish bureaucrat, probably sweating to death in a wool uniform, trying to enforce decrees from a king who's, sitting in a palace an ocean away.
And then there's the guy across the road.
Yes. The guy who just bought the plot of dirt across the road is this American frontiersman in a buckskin jacket. He's
Yeah.
carrying a long rifle, and he has zero interest in European kings or colonial bureaucracy.
None whatsoever.
It's a society where the rules of civilization, of religion, and commerce are literally being written, erased, and rewritten in real time.
It completely shatters those neat, color-coded maps we're also used to seeing in our high school history books.
Totally.
We have this tendency to view westward expansion as this clean, orderly progression, like a solid line moving steadily from the east coast to the west.
Right, like Manifest Destiny was just a scheduled train ride.
Exactly. But on the ground, the early frontier was this massive, chaotic collision of empires and cultures and totally different economic systems.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to truly understand how America pushed west, you have to look at the crucible where that collision actually happened.
And that is Missouri.
Right. Early Missouri wasn't just another state on the map. It was the ultimate cultural crossroads of the continent, a place that violently pinballed between French, Spanish, and American rule.
Yeah, it was the absolute bleeding edge of the frontier.
So today, for you listening, we are going to be shortcutting through centuries of history for this deep dive. We're exploring the stark, just fascinating contrasts of this territory. We've got the cosmopolitan urban merchants getting rich in St. Louis, all the way to the gritty rural farmers forging a really brutal life out in the wilderness.
And it all starts with a physical geography. Missouri makes it the inevitable stage for this drama. I mean, you have the Mississippi River, the Missouri River, and the Ohio River all converging right in this general area.
It's basically the ultimate intersection.
Exactly. Whoever controls that confluence basically controls the entire logistical nervous system of North America. And the very first European powers to fully grasp the strategic importance of that muddy water were the French.
Which takes us all the way back to 1673. Because, we always hear about the English at Jamestown or the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock.
All right, the classic East Coast narrative.
Yeah, but right in the dead center of the continent, you have the French Jesuit priest Jacques Marquette and the trader Louis Joliet just paddling down the Mississippi in canoes.
And their arrival wasn't just some casual exploring. It was the opening move in a massive geopolitical chess match.
Oh, for sure.
By the late 1680s and 90s, France was aggressively pursuing the colonization of Central North America with two very specific goals in mind.
Okay, what were they?
First, they wanted to lock down the incredibly lucrative fur trade. But second, and honestly more importantly from a strategic level, they desperately needed to build a wall of influence.
A wall against who? The English.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To thwart the English colonies from expanding westward across the continent. So they start planting these small missions and forts.
Right, like you get a Jesuit priest, Pierre Gabriel Marest, establishing a mission in late 1700 on the west bank of the Mississippi. But what I find fascinating from the sources is that he didn't just show up alone and start building. He brought a large band of Kaskaskia people with him.
Yeah, the indigenous presence is crucial here.
Right, because they had fled from the eastern Illinois country, seeking French protection from the Iroquois.
It perfectly illustrates how intertwined the Native American populations were with these early European arrivals. I mean, the European footprint was incredibly light at this point.
They weren't exactly a conquering army.
Not at all. The French couldn't dictate terms. They had to form symbiotic relationships with the indigenous tribes just to survive the winter.
So they were kind of blending in out of necessity.
Yeah. And this entire region was initially conceived of by everyone. Native Americans, French imperial officials, local settlers, as being part of the broader Illinois country.
Okay.
To cement this, the French government built Fort Deschartres, which was about 18 miles north of Kaskaskia, to be their base of military operations. They were prospecting for lead, hoping to find silver, and just generally trying to project power.
They even sent an officer named Etienne de Vignard to build Fort Orleans in 1723, right?
Yeah, specifically to protect their trade networks on the Missouri River from Spanish influence, which was creeping up from the southwest.
Wait, I have to stop you there because projecting power sounds very grand, like they had this massive grip on the region, but these early attempts were actually a total financial disaster, right?
Oh, completely.
The company backing these expeditions took massive losses in 1720, and by the 1730s and 40s, French control over the Missouri side of the river was basically non-existent. Like, there weren't any permanent European settlements on the western bank of the Mississippi at all.
You're entirely right. It was a paper empire. It looked great on a map in Paris, but on the ground, nothing.
Just trees and river.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It wasn't until 1750 that we see a real anchor drop, and that is the construction of the settlement of St. Genevieve.
Okay, St. Genevieve.
Now, this is a crucial baseline for everything that follows in our deep dive today. St. Genevieve was built to be a farming community, but its location was incredibly problematic.
Face of the mud, right.
Yeah, they built it on a flat, muddy floodplain right along the river. Because of the frequent flooding and just the harsh conditions generally, it grew at an agonizingly slow pace.
So how small are we talking?
Well, by 1752, historical records indicate it only had 23 full-time residents.
23 people. That is barely a dinner party, let alone a frontier town.
It was tiny, but it was foundational. Using enslaved African and Native peoples, this small cluster of settlers focused intensely on agriculture, specifically growing wheat, corn, and tobacco. They basically became the agricultural anchor for the entire region.
But just as they start actually getting some crops out of the mud, the imperial chessboard gets completely flipped over.
The French and Indian War.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It breaks out in 1754. England and France spend years fighting this brutal war over control of the Ohio Valley. Ultimately, England wins and France is forced to give up its holdings.
Right.
But here is where the geopolitics get incredibly sneaky. Before the ink can even dry on the public surrender to England, France secretly gives control of Louisiana, which includes the entire Missouri territory, to Spain.
The Treaty of Fontainebleau in November 1762.
Yes. It was a massive shockwave designed to keep the territory out of British hands. France knew they were going to lose the war, so they just handed the massive western territory to their ally, Spain, basically just to spite the British.
It's incredible level of geopolitical pettiness.
Yeah.
But ironically, it is right at this exact moment of imperial collapse that the story of St. Louis actually begins.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right around the time of this secret treaty, the outgoing French governor of Louisiana granted a massive trade monopoly over the western parts of the Illinois country.
Ooh.
He gave it to a wealthy New Orleans merchant named Gilbert Antoine de Saint-Maxent and his partner, Pierre Laclede.
So in August 1763, Laclede and his teenage stepson, Auguste Chouteau, head upriver to cash in on this monopoly.
Right.
And in February 1764, they establish St. Louis. But unlike the muddy farmers down in St. Genevieve, they pick a highly strategic spot, right? High up on the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi.
Yeah. Notice the stark contrast from day one here. St. Genevieve is a muddy, struggling agricultural outpost. St. Louis is established on prime real estate, safe above the floodwaters, by wealthy merchants holding an exclusive trade monopoly.
Totally different vibe.
Completely. St. Louis is laser-focused on one thing and one thing only: the extraction of wealth via the fur trade.
And this laser focus leads to one of the most absurd dynamics of early Missouri. The residents of St. Louis were so hyper-obsessed with trading fur and making these massive fortunes that they completely refused to farm.
Yeah, they just wouldn't do it.
They didn't plant crops, they didn't raise livestock, they just traded pelts. And as a result, this town of wealthy merchants actually suffered from periodic food shortages.
It's so ironic.
So they literally had to float down the river and beg their neighbors in St. Genevieve for wheat and corn just to survive the winter.
Which earned St. Louis a rather embarrassing nickname from those farmers: Pain Court. Yeah. While some linguistic historians debate whether it might just be a traditional French place name, the popular and enduring translation at the time was short of bread.
Short of bread. I love that.
It perfectly encapsulates the deep economic divide that would define Missouri for centuries. You have the wealthy, cosmopolitan, commercially focused urban hub acting as a bit of a parasite on the gritty agricultural labor of the rural countryside.
So you have these French fur traders hoarding pelts and begging for bread. But officially, Spain now owns this territory.
Yeah, with the secret treaty.
Right. And the Spanish inherited a demographic nightmare. The population was overwhelmingly French and Catholic, and to make matters worse for Spain, because the British had just taken over the eastern side of the Mississippi River, French settlers living over there were terrified of living under British Protestant rule.
Naturally.
So they packed up and fled across the river into Spanish Missouri. Spain suddenly finds itself trying to govern a rapidly growing, fiercely independent French population that has absolutely no loyalty to Madrid.
I mean, if you were the Spanish governor, how do you handle that?
You don't.
You're thousands of miles from your supply lines.
Oh.
You don't have enough troops. If you march into St. Louis and demand everyone start speaking Spanish, paying Spanish taxes, and abiding by strict Spanish colonial law,
You are going to face a violent revolt immediately.
instantly. So they didn't. They just folded.
They really did.
They adapted out of sheer necessity. Spanish governance on the Missouri frontier was incredibly, uncharacteristically flexible.
How flexible are we talking?
Well, when the Spanish official Pedro Pirnes finally arrived to fully replace the French administrator in 1770, he didn't purge the local government. He actually retained the veteran French administrator as his chief advisor.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And in St. Genevieve, the local administrators were officially appointed by Spain. But in practice, they frequently had to just acquiesce to local French customs and common law to keep the peace.
You know, I look at it like a hostile corporate takeover.
Okay, how so?
Well, the new Spanish executives show up at the Frontier branch office in St. Louis, right? They look around the warehouse and they realize the French middle managers are the only people who know how the supply chain actually works.
That's very true.
If they fire them, the whole company collapses. So the Spanish executives just put their feet up on the desk, collect their salaries, and let the French keep running the floor.
That's actually a very accurate way to view it. Throughout the 1770s, Spanish officials were in a highly precarious position. They were contending not just with their stubborn French populace, but with repeated aggressive incursions from British traders pushing in from the east and hostile indigenous tribes pushing back against settlement.
So they were getting squeezed from all sides.
Exactly. The Spanish realized they had a fundamental math problem. They needed bodies. They needed a loyal population to physically occupy and hold the territory.
So they start running these aggressive real estate promotions. In 1778, the Spanish government offered incredibly generous land grants, basic farming supplies, and guaranteed access to enslaved African Americans, specifically to Catholic immigrants living on the British-controlled east bank of the river, trying to lure them over.
But it wasn't enough. The trickle of Catholic immigrants couldn't match the speed at which the British and soon the newly independent Americans were pushing toward the Mississippi.
The Americans were moving fast.
Very fast. By the 1790s, the strategic situation for Spain was desperate. The Anglo-Spanish War kicked off in 1796, meaning Spain was now openly at war with Britain.
Right.
The Spanish governor of Louisiana, Francisco Luis Hector de Carondelet, looked at his maps and realized a British invasion of the Mississippi Valley was a very real possibility. He needed a massive, immediate influx of settlers to act as a human shield.
So what does he do?
He made a decision that fundamentally altered the course of North American history. He invited the Americans in.
Hold on, I need to make sure I understand the absolute insanity of this logic. The Spanish are terrified of losing their territory to the British.
Correct.
And their solution to protect it is to invite the Americans, the very people who are aggressively extending westward, gobbling up land, and openly dreaming of a continental empire, to just come live inside the Spanish borders.
Yes.
That is the definition of a Trojan horse. Why would they hand the keys to the castle over to their most dangerous rival?
From a purely strategic standpoint, it was a massive gamble born of utter desperation. Carondelet believed that if he gave the Americans an incredibly sweet deal, they would become loyal subjects of Spain out of sheer economic self-interest.
So he thought he could buy their loyalty.
Exactly, and that they would fight the British for him. Spain offered U.S. settlers free land, thousands of acres of it. They offered zero taxes. They offered absolute guarantees that the Americans could keep their enslaved laborers.
Wow.
And, perhaps most surprisingly, they offered a de facto religious tolerance.
Even though they were Catholic.
Right. Officially, Protestantism was banned in Spanish territory.
Yeah.
But Carondelet essentially told his officials to look the other way and just not enforce it.
And the Americans took the deal immediately. I mean, of course they did. If you are a pioneer sitting in Kentucky or Illinois, this is the deal of a lifetime.
It really was.
Let's talk about why they were so eager to leave American soil in the first place. In Kentucky, The land claim system was a total mess. People were constantly losing their farms because they couldn't get clear legal titles. So free land in Missouri with a clear Spanish deed sounded amazing.
Absolutely.
And in Illinois, you had the Northwest Ordinance.
Right, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is crucial here. It was an act passed by the U.S. Congress that created the Northwest Territory, which included modern-day Illinois. And it explicitly prohibited slavery in that territory.
Which was a big deal for wealthy settlers.
Exactly. Now, enforcement was spotty, but for wealthy American slaveholders, it created an intolerable legal gray area. They were constantly paranoid that the federal government would suddenly seize their enslaved workforce.
So when Spain waves a flag across the Mississippi River saying, come over here, the land is free and your human property is legally protected, it triggered a massive exodus.
It absolutely did. Famous pioneers, people whose names are mythological in American history, took the bait.
Like Daniel Boone.
Yes, Daniel Boone himself packed up his entire extended family and moved into Spanish-controlled Missouri. He actually became a Spanish official for a brief time, serving as a syndic or local judge.
That is wild. Daniel Boone as a Spanish judge. But Carondelet's grand strategy backfired spectacularly, right?
Oh, it was a disaster for them.
Spain essentially engineered its own demographic demise. By inviting the Americans in, they fundamentally Americanized the territory from the inside out.
Yeah, by the mid-1790s, Spanish officials were sending panicked letters back to Madrid. They realized these new Protestant immigrants had zero interest in converting to Catholicism, they were ignoring Spanish laws, and they possessed absolutely no genuine loyalty to the Spanish crown.
They were just Americans living on Spanish dirt. And the numbers are staggering. We aren't talking about a few dozen families. By 1804, more than 3/5 of the total population in Upper Louisiana, meaning Missouri, were immigrants from the United States. Spain had accidentally conquered itself.
Seeing the writing on the wall and realizing this colonial investment was yielding nothing but headaches and military vulnerabilities, Spain decided to cut its losses.
So they bail.
They bail. In 1800, Spain negotiated the Treaty of San Ildefonso, secretly returning the entire Louisiana territory back to France.
But the French barely had time to unpack their bags. Napoleon Bonaparte is running the show in France now, and he has massive problems.
Massive.
He had planned to use the Louisiana territory as the breadbasket for a renewed French empire in the Americas. But the crown jewel of that empire was the sugar-producing colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti.
Right.
And in Haiti, an uprising of enslaved people absolutely decimated the French forces. Napoleon lost his army, he lost his sugar profits, and he was gearing up for a massive, incredibly expensive war with Great Britain. He needed cash immediately.
So when American diplomats approached Napoleon in 1803 to inquire about buying just the port of New Orleans to secure their trade routes, Napoleon shocked them.
He offered them everything.
Everything. He offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory, 828,000 square miles, for $15 million. It was roughly 3 cents an acre.
3 cents an acre.
Yeah. The Louisiana Purchase instantly doubled the size of the United States.
Which leads to one of the most surreal logistical moments in early American history. Because the span of handover back to France in 1800 had been kept a secret, the Spanish officials were still physically sitting in the government offices in St. Louis in 1804, collecting taxes and stamping papers.
It was so confusing for everyone on the ground.
Right. When the news finally reached the frontier that the Americans had bought the land from the French, they had to untangle this massive bureaucratic knot.
So they held a special, highly choreographed transfer of power ceremony in St. Louis in March of 1804, known as Three Flags Day.
I try to imagine standing in the muddy town square for that. You watch the Spanish flag come down after 40 years. Then they run the French flag up the pole and leave it there for just one day, purely as a legal formality so France can officially claim they owned it before they sold it.
Just a paperwork exercise, basically.
Yeah. And then the next morning, the French flag comes down and the American flag goes up. 3 massive global empires swapping ownership of your house in the blink of an eye. You really have to wonder how the average fur trapper or farmer processed that. Did it feel momentous? Or were they just annoyed that they had to learn a new set of tax codes?
Honestly, for many of the French Creoles and the newly arrived Americans, it was likely viewed with deep skepticism. They didn't want interference from anyone, and unfortunately, their skepticism was entirely validated because the transition to American territorial governance was anything but smooth.
That's an understatement.
In fact, the early American territorial governors were an unmitigated disaster.
Disaster doesn't even begin to cover it. Let's look at the roster of leaders Thomas Jefferson sent out to manage this delicate, newly acquired frontier. First up, President Jefferson appoints James Wilkinson as the first territorial governor in 1805.
Oh, Wilkinson.
Now, Wilkinson wasn't just a bad administrator, he was actively a traitor to the United States.
It is one of the most wild subplots in early American history. General James Wilkinson was secretly a paid agent of the Spanish crown.
Literally on their payroll.
Yes, known in their intelligence files as Agent 13. While serving as the American governor of Missouri, he was actively involved in what became known as the Burr Conspiracy.
Okay, we need to dive into this because how does a sitting U.S. governor conspire to overthrow the government? What was the actual plot?
Well, the frontier was incredibly isolated from Washington, D.C. Communication took weeks or even months. Wilkinson and former Vice President Aaron Burr saw that isolation as an opportunity. Their vague, highly treasonous plan was to raise a private mercenary army, leverage the discontent of the frontier settlers, and launch a military expedition to carve out a brand new independent empire in the center of the continent, likely taking pieces of the Louisiana Territory and Spanish Mexico.
So the very guy Jefferson put in charge of integrating Missouri into the United States is secretly plotting to steal it and make himself a king.
Exactly.
And beyond the treason, Wilkinson was just universally despised locally. He was known for heavy drinking, rampant corruption, and he constantly tried to use his political office to steal the business of the local French Creole fur traders.
He was a terrible governor on every level.
He alienated absolutely everyone and was unceremoniously fired in 1807.
So Washington tries to course correct. They replace the corrupt traitor with an absolute American hero, Meriwether Lewis.
Right, from Lewis and Clark.
He is fresh off his triumphant expedition to the Pacific with William Clark. He knows the land, he knows the people. It seems like the perfect appointment.
But Lewis was brilliant, yet deeply troubled, wasn't he?
He was. The transition from a military explorer to a bureaucratic politician completely destroyed him. He hated the endless paperwork, the land disputes, the squabbling factions in St. Louis.
It's a completely different skill set.
Exactly. The immense pressures of frontier governance exacerbated his intense moodiness and led to heavy drinking. He made powerful political enemies who began questioning his financial accounts in Washington.
That's so sad.
In 1809, while traveling back to D.C. to clear his name, he died at an inn in Tennessee by apparent suicide. It was a tragic end for a national hero, and it left the Missouri Territory in administrative chaos once again.
It wasn't until William Clark Lewis's former partner finally took the reins in 1813 that the territory saw any real stability.
Clark was pragmatic. He understood the complex web of indigenous treaties, he knew how to negotiate with the wealthy French fur barons like the Chouteaus, and he knew how to govern fairly without dictating from on high.
But even with stable local leadership under Clark, the territory was hurtling toward a massive national crisis.
This brings us to the Missouri crisis of 1818 and 1820.
Right. By 1818, the population had boomed, and the territorial legislature formally requested admission to the Union as a state. On paper, it should have been a routine rubber stamp process. They had the population, they had the infrastructure.
But Missouri's application ignited a terrifying national controversy over the single most explosive issue in America, the institution of slavery.
Up until this point, there had been a delicate, unspoken balance in the U.S. Senate between states that permitted slavery and states that had abolished it. Missouri threatened to break that balance.
It did. Northern U.S. opposition to slavery's expansion across the Mississippi River clashed violently with a growing Southern white defense of it as an economic necessity.
And the spark that set off the powder keg came from a New York congressman named James Tallmadge. When the Missouri statehood bill came before the House, Tallmadge stood up and attached two highly controversial amendments.
The Tallmadge Amendment.
I want to walk through the mechanics of these amendments because they are crucial to understand. First, the amendment prohibited any new enslaved people from being brought into Missouri. The border would be closed to the slave trade.
Right.
Second, it required the gradual emancipation of all enslaved people who were born there after statehood, setting them free once they reached the age of 25.
Tallmadge was effectively trying to force a gradual abolition plan on Missouri as a strict, non-negotiable condition of joining the Union. He wasn't demanding immediate freedom for everyone, which was politically impossible at the time, but he was creating a legislative time bomb that would eventually erase slavery from the state.
And the Southern reaction was absolute fury. The bill with the Tallmadge amendments actually passed the House of Representatives, where the North had a population advantage. But when it hit the Senate, Southern senators repeatedly blocked it.
The government completely gridlocked.
This wasn't just a polite debate over tax policy. This was a fundamental dispute over the economic and moral future of the country. Thomas Jefferson, watching this unfold from his retirement at Monticello, famously wrote that the crisis terrified him like a fire bell in the night, and that he considered it the knell of the Union.
It was eventually resolved, or more accurately, it was band-aided over by the Missouri Compromise of 1820.
Engineered primarily by Henry Clay.
Yes. The mechanics of the deal were simple but profound. Missouri would be admitted to the Union as a slave state without the Tallmadge restrictions. To maintain the balance of power, Maine would be carved out of Massachusetts and admitted as a free state.
And then there was the line, right?
Crucially, a geographic line was drawn across the rest of the Louisiana Territory at the 36-degree 30-yard parallel. Slavery would be legally banned north of that line forever.
So in 1821, after years of bitter fighting, Missouri officially becomes the 24th state. But looking back at that whole chain of events, it makes you wonder about the massive what-ifs of history.
Oh, there are so many.
What if Spain had strictly enforced Catholicism back in the 1790s? What if Carondelet had fortified the river instead of inviting American slaveholders to cross over? The American westward expansion might have violently stalled right there on the eastern bank of the Mississippi.
The demographic makeup of Missouri would have been entirely different.
And the Great Missouri Crisis of 1820 might never have happened, which means the trajectory toward the American Civil War would have been fundamentally altered.
It highlights how delicate historical timelines really are. But the reality on the ground was that the American flag was now firmly planted, the political crisis was temporarily delayed, and the floodgates for settlement were thrown wide open.
And as those new settlers poured in, they rapidly split the state's identity into two deeply contrasting worlds.
Let's talk about the first world, the urban engine.
Right. Once Missouri became a state, St. Louis didn't just grow, it mutated. It evolved from a French fur trading outpost where people begged for bread into the undisputed, roaring gateway to the West.
And geography was the absolute dictator of this boom.
Completely. Look at a physical map. St. Louis sits just below the confluence of the Mississippi, the Ohio, and the Missouri rivers. It was the geographic center of the continent's logistics and information networks. Every single thing moving east, west, north, or south had to float past St. Louis.
But geography alone isn't enough. You need the technology to exploit it.
Right.
And that technology was the steamboat.
The steamboat changes everything.
The first steamboat, the Zebulon M. Pike, arrived in St. Louis in 1817. The impact of the steam engine on the human perception of time and space cannot be overstated. We need to look at how travel worked before steam power to fully appreciate this.
Exactly. Before the steamboat, if you wanted to move massive amounts of freight upriver from New Orleans to Louisville or St. Louis, you had to use keelboats or flatboats,
Which was incredibly labor-intensive.
Going upriver against the current of the Mississippi was a nightmare. Crews literally had to walk along the muddy riverbanks, pulling the boats with thick ropes, or use long poles to push against the river bottom. A trip from New Orleans up to Louisville using human muscle took 3 to 4 grueling months.
But the steamboat defied nature. It could push heavy cargo straight upriver against the current, effortlessly. By 1838, steamboats were making that exact same New Orleans to Louisville trip in 6 days or less.
6 days instead of 3 months.
It was a revolution in the collapse of time and distance. The tonnage of freight being moved was astronomical, transforming the entire economic scale of the region.
I love thinking about St. Louis in this era as the 19th century version of Silicon Valley.
That's a great analogy.
Think about it. If you had a crazy startup idea in the 1840s, like, say, walking 2,000 miles across a desert and over the Rocky Mountains to California to dig for gold in 1849, St. Louis was your incubator. You couldn't just walk out of your house in New York and head west. You went to St. Louis.
Because that's where the rivers met, that's where the venture capital was.
Exactly. That's where you could hire experienced frontier guides, and that's where the massive outfitters were located. The merchants in St. Louis got incredibly obscenely rich, and they didn't do it by risking their lives mining for gold. They got rich by selling shovels, wagons, salted pork, and heavy canvas to the desperate, gold-crazed prospectors heading west.
And that explosion of merchant wealth created a highly diverse, cosmopolitan urban demographic that looked nothing like the rest of the frontier.
He was a real melting pot.
The business leadership in St. Louis was no longer just the old French Creole families. It was dominated by Yankee businessmen arriving from the East Coast and wealthy Southern elites bringing their capital. The physical working class building the city consisted heavily of German craftsmen and skilled immigrants fleeing European turmoil.
And the politics shifted, too.
Yeah, the rapidly expanding political sphere was dominated by a mix of Southerners and newly arrived Irish Catholic immigrants.
It was a total high-speed melting pot.
Yeah.
By 1845, St. Louis was physically connected to the East Coast by telegraph wires. They had established the first banks west of the Mississippi. They built the first college west of the river, St. Louis University, all the way back in 1818.
The speed of this transition is genuinely staggering to think about.
Within a single generation, the pioneer brain had to completely rewire itself. A person could go from experiencing profound, months-long isolation in a muddy wooden outpost to being hyper-plugged into the global market, reading news printed off a telegraph machine in St. Louis on the exact same day it happened in Washington or New York.
It was a marvel of the modern age. But that hyper-connected telegraph speed life in St. Louis was a bubble.
Right, it didn't extend very far.
Not at all. If you stepped off that bustling, cosmopolitan steamboat dock, walked past the banks of the universities, and traveled just a few miles inland away from the river, that urban hub vanished instantly.
The telegraph wire stopped.
The paved roads ended, and you were thrust into an entirely different universe. A reality tied strictly, and sometimes brutally, to the dirt.
Which means we need to talk about the rural reality of Missouri, because the daily lived experience of the rural Missouri farmer was completely alien to the merchant sitting in a St. Louis coffeehouse.
Rural Missouri was entirely dominated by agriculture, but it wasn't a monolith. Even within the farming communities, there were distinct cultural zones dictated by the specific geography of the land.
Give me an example.
For example, if you look at the region along the Missouri River, which became known as Little Dixie, it was settled predominantly by wealthy planters from Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. They brought the traditional Upper South agricultural system with them.
So large plantations.
Yes, they bought up huge, sprawling tracts of highly fertile bottomland and focused entirely on commercial agriculture. They weren't growing food to survive, they were growing cash crops, specifically hemp and tobacco, heavily and exclusively utilizing enslaved labor to do the brutal work of harvesting it.
And then if you travel south into the rocky, hilly terrain of the Ozarks, the farming culture shifts completely, right?
Entirely different.
Before 1870, the original Ozark settlers weren't planting massive fields of cash crops. The soil wouldn't support it. They were essentially part-time farmers who relied heavily on hunting wild game and herding livestock through the open woods just for basic subsistence. It wasn't until much later that the region transitioned to the diverse, full-time small farm operations we think of today.
What's fascinating here is how this profound rural isolation shaped the mindset of the settlers, in direct contrast to the urban connectivity of St. Louis.
How so?
For the rural Missouri farmer, land ownership was absolutely everything. It wasn't just a financial asset in a portfolio. Owning land was a badge of supreme independence, a physical guarantee of security against starvation, and the essential mechanism for controlling a labor force, whether that labor force consisted of enslaved people or simply the farmer's own wife and children.
You know, we have this deeply ingrained romantic image in American pop culture of the solitary, rugged pioneer.
The lone frontiersman.
Right. The guy who packs a single wagon, rides out into the deep woods completely alone, chops down trees, and carves out a homestead with his bare hands. But historical reality paints a vastly different picture. You didn't survive the frontier alone. If you wanted to make it, you brought a massive network with you.
The lone frontiersman is largely a myth. Migration and settlement were highly organized communal efforts. Families typically did not move as solitary units.
They moved as a whole clan.
Yes, as elements of large, deeply interwoven kin-leased networks. Grandparents, adult children, cousins, and in-laws would all pack up and move together. When they arrived in Missouri, these extended families would buy large, clustered tracts of land adjacent to one another.
And that makes perfect sense mechanically. If you need to clear 40 acres of old-growth timber, you can't do it alone. If you cluster your family, you can pool your labor to build barns. You share plows and draft animals. If someone gets sick or injured, the kin network acts as a social safety net to prevent the farm from failing. It provided a crucial buffer against the incredible hardships and isolation of frontier life.
And this intense, survival-based focus on the family unit extended deeply into the gender dynamics of the frontier, which varied wildly depending on your cultural background.
Like the French versus the American.
Exactly. There is a brilliant contrast observed in the early 19th century between the French and American households in Missouri. In the traditional French families, the social structure placed the mother firmly at the head of the house.
She managed everything inside.
She managed the domestic economy. These French women were culturally celebrated, particularly for their culinary skills, blending French staples with African and Creole influences to create dishes like gumbo and rich fricassees.
But in the American pioneer families, the dynamic was starkly different. American men generally treated their wives as fellow workers. The mother was subordinate to the men in the social hierarchy, yet she was expected to perform grueling, back-breaking physical labor from dawn to dusk just to keep the family alive in a harsh environment. She wasn't celebrated as a matriarch. She was an essential gear in the agricultural machine.
It was a remarkably hard life. And we can't discuss the mechanics of rural Missouri agriculture without mentioning the specific animal that made it all function and what the state became nationally famous for, the Missouri mule.
The famous mule. It sounds like a quaint piece of state trivia now, but at the time, this was basically cutting-edge agricultural technology.
It truly was. Missouri farmers realized they needed a draft animal that was tougher than a horse and stronger than a standard donkey. So they began aggressively crossbreeding, mixing rugged Mexican donkey stock with larger eastern horse breeds.
And what did they get?
The result was a vastly superior, incredibly resilient hybrid animal. The Missouri mule became vital to the American economy. They were the engines that physically pulled the heavy freight wagons on the Santa Fe and Oregon trails, and they were the primary draft animals sold downriver to plow the massive sugar and cotton plantations in the Deep South.
So it was a huge business.
The mule breeding industry became a massive economic driver, providing a lucrative livelihood for traders and a crucial supplemental income for countless small farmers.
So paint the picture of this rural society. You have these tightly knit, highly insular, kin-based networks of farmers. They are deeply tied to their specific plots of land. They are fiercely independent, and they are heavily armed.
Right.
They have spent decades establishing their own specific way of life, their own agricultural economy, and their own rigid social hierarchy. And then a massive new group of people moves directly into their neighborhood, a group with radically different, deeply uncompromising ideas about how society, economy, and religion should be run.
It is the perfect recipe for a violent culture clash. When deep ideological friction occurs on the frontier and the democratic institutions are too weak to mediate it, the results are almost always explosive.
To understand the explosion, we have to set the religious scene first. Back under Spanish rule, Protestantism was technically illegal. But once the Americans took over, those restrictions vanished, and Protestant itinerant ministers flooded the territory. You had Baptists, Presbyterians, and Methodists riding circuits through the wilderness.
And they utilized a very specific, highly effective method of frontier worship, the camp meeting.
Tell us about the camp meetings.
The camp meeting was a massive social and spiritual phenomenon. Because there were very few physical church buildings, travelers and locals would gather in the woods, set up tents in a large circular area, and hold services outdoors for days at a time.
It sounds pretty intense.
It was. The worship was characterized by intense emotional outbursts, weeping, shouting, and highly passionate, fiery preaching. It was raw, it was deeply individualistic, and it perfectly suited the rugged, decentralized nature of the rural pioneers. It was a religion of the individual standing alone before God in the wilderness.
Picture that wild, emotional, decentralized, fiercely individualistic camp meeting. Now, juxtapose that image with what happened in 1830. A young man named Joseph Smith, along with the early members of the newly formed Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, arrived on the western edge of Missouri in Jackson County, near the town of Independence.
And Joseph Smith didn't just arrive and buy a farm. He declared that by direct divine revelation, this specific geographic area around Independence was to become Zion. It was prophesied to be the ultimate gathering place for his followers to build a holy city.
The influx was immediate and massive. By 1833, just 3 years later, Mormons made up roughly 1/3 of the entire population of Jackson County. There were about 1,200 followers living there. And the tension between the existing Missouri pioneers and the new Mormon arrivals skyrocketed past suspicion and straight into absolute hostility.
If we look closely at the historical dynamics and remaining impartial to the religious doctrines themselves, we see clearly that this wasn't just a theological debate over Scripture. The Mormons represented a profound economic, political, and cultural threat to the local Missourians.
Because they operated so communally.
Exactly. They pooled their money and purchased large tracts of land in bulk, with the open intention of physically dominating the county. Because they voted in unified blocks directed by their church leadership, they wielded immense, disproportionate political power that threatened to completely disenfranchise the older settlers.
And economically, they were isolating themselves.
Furthermore, they typically traded only among themselves, effectively cutting the local frontier merchants out of the economy.
It is the ultimate culture clash. You have fiercely individualistic Missouri pioneers whose entire wealth is based on individual land ownership and expanding the institution of slavery, colliding with a highly communal, religiously exclusive group that votes as a monolith, controls the local economy, and crucially espouses abolitionist views in a slave state. The Missourians felt they were being invaded and erased in their own homes.
The violence became inevitable. The locals decided that the legal system couldn't protect their way of life, so they stepped outside it. In July 1833, hundreds of non-Mormon citizens held a mass meeting at the Independence Courthouse. They drafted a manifesto demanding the immediate expulsion of all Mormons from the county.
And when they refused,
When the Mormon leadership refused to abandon Zion, armed mobs attacked. They destroyed the Mormon printing press, and they publicly tarred and feathered 2 Mormon leaders in the town square.
under the threat of mass murder, the Mormons initially agreed to leave Jackson County. But after the Missouri governor, Daniel Dunklin, vaguely promised them legal protection, they decided to stay and fight for their land, bringing in even more settlers.
Which just poured gasoline on the fire.
The local Missouri mobs were enraged by this defiance. They attacked again in October of 1833, burning homes and destroying crops. And the state militia, largely made up of locals who sympathized with the mobs, refused to intervene. The Mormons were forced to flee for their lives to nearby Clay County, and later they moved to Caldwell County, where they founded the town of Far West.
But moving the problem didn't solve the underlying cultural friction. In 1838, an election dispute in Daviess County over whether Mormons were legally allowed to vote erupted into a massive brawl, which rapidly escalated into open warfare across multiple counties.
The 1838 Mormon War.
Yes, armed militias on both sides mobilized, farms were burned, livestock was slaughtered, and people on both sides, including unarmed civilians, were killed.
The chaos reached the highest levels of the state government, leading to one of the most shocking and chilling official documents in American history. Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs, who had previously been a resident of Jackson County and hated the Mormons, raised a massive state militia and issued Executive Order 44. I want to quote the language of this order directly from the sources because it is staggering. The governor of an American state wrote, "The Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace."
It is an official, state-sponsored extermination order directed against a religious minority. It perfectly showcases the extreme fragility of the rule of law on the frontier. When the local majority felt their economic and political dominance was threatened and the democratic legal system couldn't resolve the friction, state-sponsored ethnic cleansing became the default mechanism for solving the problem.
What happened next?
Facing overwhelming military force, the Mormon defenders surrendered at Far West. Their leaders, including Joseph Smith, were thrown into a freezing jail, and the entire community of thousands of men, women, and children was forced to flee on foot across the frozen Mississippi River to Illinois in the dead of winter.
It's a mind-boggling regression. Think about it. Early Missouri started under the Spanish with this pragmatic, de facto religious tolerance where everyone just looked the other way to survive and trade. Just a few decades later, an American governor is literally signing a document legalizing the murder of citizens based on their faith. The culture shifted violently toward extreme intolerance.
And we have to acknowledge that a significant part of that violent intolerance toward the Mormons was driven by deep-seated fears surrounding their abolitionist views. Because the Missouri pioneers were fiercely, violently protective of the institution that underpinned much of their agricultural wealth and social hierarchy. Which forces us to confront the darkest, most defining contrast of early Missouri life.
It does. We need to examine the reality of slavery on the frontier. Now, for you listening, we are going to look strictly at the historical facts and contemporary accounts regarding the economic and social realities of the time to understand how the system actually functioned on the ground impartially.
The historical record is entirely unambiguous. Slavery was deeply integral to Missouri's economy. It wasn't a fringe practice. It was the core economic engine, particularly in the hemp and tobacco farms of the Little Dixie region we discussed earlier, and heavily concentrated along the fertile banks of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. By the time we reach 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, enslaved African Americans made up nearly 10% of the state's total population.
But the mechanics of slavery in Missouri look different than in the Deep South, right? Missouri slavery had a distinctively intimate quality compared to the massive, sprawling cotton plantations of Mississippi or South Carolina.
Yes, intimate in quotes.
Right. Missouri enslavers owned smaller tracts of land and fewer people. They rarely employed professional overseers. Instead, the white enslavers worked directly alongside the enslaved people in the fields every single day. They chopped the same wood, they harvested the same hemp, and they often lived in the exact same cabins or small houses located just feet away from each other.
Because of this physical proximity, some enslavers at the time, and unfortunately some romanticized historical myths later on, claimed that this physical intimacy made for a milder, more familial version of bondage. The argument was that if you sweat next to a man in the field, you treat him better. But the historical accounts completely dismantle that self-serving narrative.
I find this dynamic so chilling. The enslavers tried to use physical closeness to excuse the horror. But the formerly enslaved abolitionist William Wells Brown completely shattered that myth. Brown was enslaved in St. Louis and experienced this system firsthand before escaping. He wrote extensively about it, stating clearly, and I'm quoting from the source here, "Though slavery is thought by some to be mild in Missouri, yet no part of our slaveholding country is more noted for the barbarity of its inhabitants than St. Louis. It is powerful proof that physical closeness does not undo the absolute fundamental horror of owning another human being."
Intimacy did not equate to humanity or equality. It was a system built entirely on total power over another person's life. The intimacy actually meant there was no escape from the surveillance and control of the enslaver. The historical records note that brandings, brutal beatings, and rape were documented, common physical abuses on these small frontier farms.
And they tried to control their minds, too.
Furthermore, the oppression was legally institutionalized. In 1847, the Missouri State Legislature passed a law that explicitly prohibited teaching, reading, or writing to any enslaved person. They weren't just controlling the physical bodies, they were actively attempting to create permanent mental and intellectual barriers to prevent any possibility of upward mobility or coordinated resistance.
And beyond the physical abuse, the psychological terror of family separation was a constant, brutal reality of the Missouri slave trade. St. Louis wasn't just a hub for selling shovels to gold miners, it was a major hub for human trafficking. The eastern doors of the St. Louis courthouse served as a primary slave market.
It's a dark stain on the city's history.
Contemporary accounts record horrifying scenes of women regularly buying infant children straight from the arms of their enslaved mothers, simply to raise the children as property and sell them at a higher profit later when they were old enough to work.
It is a dark irony that it was at that very same St. Louis courthouse, where families were being torn apart on the steps, that one of the most consequential legal battles in American history began in 1846. An enslaved man named Dred Scott, along with his wife Harriet, filed a lawsuit demanding their freedom.
Let's walk through the legal premise of this case, because Dred Scott wasn't just asking for mercy, he was pointing to a specific legal precedent. The Scots' argument was based on the fact that their enslaver, an army surgeon, had previously taken them to live in the free state of Illinois and later to the free Wisconsin territory, where slavery was explicitly banned by the Missouri Compromise.
Right, the once free, always free precedent.
Exactly. The legal precedent at the time was once free, always free. Therefore, Dred Scott argued, the moment his enslaver brought him into free territory, his bondage legally dissolved and returning to Missouri could not re-enslave him.
It was a sound legal argument based on existing precedent. The case dragged through the local and state courts for 11 agonizing years, finally reaching the United States Supreme Court in 1857. And the decision handed down by Chief Justice Roger Taney was devastating, not just for the Scots, but for the entire nation.
Taney didn't just rule against Dred Scott. He took a sledgehammer to the entire concept of black rights in America. The court declared that black people, whether enslaved or free, were not and could never legally be citizens of the United States. Taney wrote that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect.
And he didn't stop there.
But he went even further. He ruled that Congress had absolutely no constitutional power to restrict slavery in the federal territories.
That specific ruling functionally overturned the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Remember the 36-degree 30-oral line we discussed earlier? The line that kept the peace for 30 years? The Supreme Court just erased it. They essentially ruled that slaveholders could take their human property anywhere in the Western territories, and the federal government couldn't stop them.
It threw absolute gasoline on the national fire.
It proved to the North that the courts were actively conspiring to spread slavery nationwide, making a political solution impossible and the Civil War almost inevitable.
But while the courts were failing in Washington, there was intense, direct action happening on the ground in Missouri. Think about the geography again. Missouri was a slave state surrounded by free territory on three sides. You had free Illinois to the east, free Iowa to the north, and the newly opening, violently contested Kansas territory to the west. The borders were incredibly porous. The Underground Railroad was highly active here throughout the 1840s and 50s.
Enslaved people were constantly making incredibly dangerous escapes, making their way to safe houses in places like Quincy, Illinois, or Tabor, Iowa. But it wasn't just a one-way street. Militant abolitionists were not just waiting safely on the other side of the border, they were actively crossing into Missouri to launch raids.
Like John Brown.
Yes. In December 1858, the famous radical abolitionist John Brown led a highly organized, daring armed raid into Vernon County, Missouri. He liberated 11 enslaved people at gunpoint and successfully escorted them on a harrowing journey all the way north to freedom in Canada.
You can imagine the absolute fever pitch of paranoia among Missouri enslavers at this point. You have a massive slave population, you have free territory bordering you on three sides, you have militant abolitionists like John Brown literally raiding your farms in the middle of the night, and the national political system is completely collapsing. It set the perfect explosive stage for the brutal cross-border guerrilla warfare that became known as Bleeding Kansas.
So the border wars of the 1850s were the direct, violent result of this volatile mix of geography and demographics. When Senator Stephen Douglas proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which allowed the white male settlers of the Kansas Territory to vote on whether they would allow slavery, the Missourians saw it as an existential threat.
If Kansas became a free state,
Missouri would be entirely surrounded, and the institution of slavery would collapse. So, heavily armed Missourians, known as border ruffians, crossed the border in the thousands to fraudulently cast ballots for pro-slavery candidates and physically intimidate free state settlers.
And in response, abolitionist groups from New England funded and armed anti-slavery settlers to pour into Kansas to oppose them. The exact same kind of localized, state-sponsored frontier justice and mob violence we saw in the Mormon War returned, but this time on a massive national scale. Towns were sacked, farms were burned, and massacres were committed by both sides across the border. The violence of early Missouri seamlessly bled right into the opening shots of the American Civil War.
It is an incredibly dense, heavy, and massively consequential history, and it demonstrates why zooming in on the specifics of this one territory is so crucial.
Exactly. We've traced this patch of land from a muddy, struggling French fur outpost that was traded secretly between European kings like a poker chip to a booming American steamboat metropolis collapsing the very concepts of time and distance. We've looked at the violently divided rural landscape marked by incredible agricultural wealth built on the brutal reality of intimate frontier slavery. We've seen how the breakdown of the rule of law led to literal extermination orders against religious minorities.
Why does delving into this specific slice of history matter today? Because it proves that the pioneer experience was never a monolith. The history books often paint the westward expansion with a single broad brush, the romantic image of the rugged covered wagon heading into the sunset. But Missouri shows us that the reality was a messy, high-speed, often violent collision.
It really was.
It was urban venture capitalists outfitting gold miners, rubbing shoulders with rugged kin-based farmers, displaced indigenous tribes, and radical religious groups. It was a pressure cooker. It was a microcosm of the modern American identity with all its brilliant innovations and horrifying flaws being forged in real time.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the muddy waters of the frontier, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We've talked continually today about the rivers, the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Ohio. Think about how the physical geography itself, the way the water carved the continent, forced all these disparate cultures to collide in this one exact spot. The rivers were the inescapable highways.
They absolutely were.
They brought the French trappers south, they brought the Yankee merchants west, they brought the Southern planters north, and they carried thousands of enslaved people into bondage. If geography truly is destiny, was Missouri geographically doomed to be the bleeding edge of America's growing pains? Could the incredible friction that ultimately ignited the Civil War have started anywhere else? Or was the fuse always inevitably going to be lit right here, at the exact spot where the cosmopolitan urban steamboats violently met the realities of the rural frontier?
It's a profound question about how much the physical landscape dictates human conflict and destiny. The muddy waters of the Mississippi didn't just carry cargo and steamboats, they carried the inescapable, explosive complexities of a rapidly growing nation.
We hope you enjoyed this extensive journey through the chaotic, contradictory, and utterly fascinating history of early Missouri. Keep digging into these historical accounts, keep asking those big, difficult questions, and remember that history is rarely as clean as a dotted line drawn on a map. Because, as we've seen today, when you step off the path and into the real story of the frontier, you are stepping into the deepest of muddy waters. Until next time.